Some of the most important moments in a person's life do not look important when they are happening. They arrive disguised as inconveniences, as embarrassments, as the kind of minor disasters that feel enormous in the moment and, in the expected order of things, should fade quietly into the background of memory within a week. A missed payment, a wrong turn, a bill you cannot cover in a diner you should not have walked into on a night that was already going wrong. These are the moments we rarely tell stories about, and yet sometimes, when luck and character and timing align in ways that no one could have engineered deliberately, one of these ordinary disasters becomes the pivot point around which an entire life turns. The rain came down in cold, steady sheets that Tuesday evening, streaking the windows of a small roadside diner and turning the parking lot into a glassy mirror of neon signs and blurred headlights. Inside, the warmth of the place wrapped around the shoulders of the few dozen patrons like an old coat familiar, a little worn, but welcome. The smell of hot coffee and grilled onions drifted through the air. Somewhere near the back, a child laughed at something his father said. Glasses clinked. Forks scraped plates. Life moved forward, as life always insists on doing, indifferent to the private storms brewing in the hearts of the people seated inside. And at a two-person table near the window, a 32-year-old woman named Emily Carter sat perfectly still, staring down at a dinner bill as though it were a verdict being read aloud in a courtroom. She reached into her purse slowly, methodically, the way a person does when they already know what they will find, but cannot yet bring themselves to accept it. She checked her wallet. She checked a second compartment. She opened her banking app and watched the number on the screen refuse to change into something more forgiving. The total on the bill was $41.70. Her account held $8.14. There was no credit card tucked into the back of the wallet, no emergency cash folded into a forgotten pocket, no one she could call in the next 5 minutes who would answer. Emily sat for 3 long seconds, absorbing the full weight of the situation, and then, quietly, with the controlled, practiced composure of someone who had learned to absorb bad news without making a scene, she set the bill back on the table, picked up her jacket from the back of the chair, and began to walk toward the door. In the far corner of the diner, a man she had never noticed looked up from his coffee and saw everything. Emily Carter had not always eaten alone in diners and counted the dollars in her account before ordering soup. There had been a time, not very long ago by the calendar, but an entire lifetime ago by feel, when she had been exactly the kind of person other people described as having it together. She had graduated with honors from a well-regarded university with a degree in communications and had walked straight into a marketing coordinator position at a mid-sized tech company in the city. Within 3 years, she was a senior account manager, leading campaigns, presenting to clients, managing a small team. She had an apartment she loved, not large, but hers, with a balcony where she kept a row of herbs in terracotta pots and a view of the street below that she found inexplicably comforting. She had savings. She had health insurance. She had weekend plans and a social calendar and a 5-year vision she believed in. She was not rich, but she was stable, and stability had felt like abundance. Then the company announced layoffs during a restructuring, and Emily's name appeared on the list. She told herself it was fine. Companies downsized. It was not personal. She had skills. She had references. She would find something quickly. She began sending applications that same week, polished, carefully tailored, accompanied by a portfolio she had spent a weekend refining. The responses came back slowly, and when they came, most of them were rejections delivered in the bland, corporate language of automated systems. 2 months passed. Then, 3. She was not panicking yet, not really, but the edges of her confidence had begun to fray. Then her mother called from across the state. The diagnosis was serious, a condition requiring surgery and a long recovery, made harder by the fact that her mother lived alone and had no one nearby to help. Emily packed a bag and drove the 4 hours without hesitation. She told herself she would find work remotely. She would manage. She always had. What she had not anticipated was how consuming it would be: the hospital visits, the medication schedules, the paperwork, the emotional weight of watching a parent become smaller and more fragile with each passing week. Her job search slowed to a near stop. The savings she had built over years began to dissolve with a quiet efficiency that terrified her. The apartment she loved became too expensive to justify. She found a smaller one, cheaper, further from everything she knew. She sold her car and began taking buses and ride-shares. She picked up freelance work wherever she could find it, writing website copy, managing social accounts for small businesses, proofreading documents for a legal firm that paid slowly and billed nothing to memory. She kept all of this largely to herself. When friends asked how she was doing, she said fine. Things were moving in the right direction. Her mother was improving. She had become very good at projecting a version of herself that did not need rescuing. But behind that version was a woman who woke at 3 in the morning and stared at spreadsheets trying to figure out how to make numbers cooperate that simply would not. The morning of that rainy Tuesday, Emily had received another rejection email, a position she had genuinely wanted. At a company she had researched thoroughly for a role that had felt like the door finally opening. The email was 3 sentences long. Thank you for your interest. After careful consideration, we have decided to move forward with another candidate. She closed the laptop and sat at the table in her small apartment for a long time without moving. That evening, almost as an act of quiet rebellion against the relentless grimness of the previous months, she decided to go out to dinner, a real dinner, not a sandwich eaten over a kitchen sink, but a proper sit-down meal at the little diner she had passed a dozen times and never entered. One good thing, just one. She had deserved at least that much. David Mercer was 38 years old, and he had learned to read a room the way sailors learn to read the weather, not as a skill exactly, but as something that had become instinctive after years of needing it. He was not a large man, not the kind of person who commanded attention when he walked in somewhere, but there was a steadiness to him that people tended to notice after a few minutes in his presence, something unhurried and reliable in the way he carried himself, as though he had long ago made peace with the fact that the world was difficult and had decided to simply continue showing up in it anyway. He had a son named Oliver, who was 9 years old, and shared his father's eyes and his late mother's laugh. A laugh David never grew tired of hearing because it was the closest thing to a sound he thought he had lost forever. His wife, Rachel, had died 6 years earlier from an aggressive form of cancer that had moved faster than the doctors had expected, and left David standing at a funeral in January holding Oliver's small hand and understanding for the first time in his life what it felt like to have the floor simply disappear beneath you. The grief had been enormous and private. He did not talk about it much, not then and not now, not because he was ashamed of it, but because there were no words that came close to describing the particular shape of that loss, the way it rewired the ordinary, made the sight of a jacket on a hook or a coffee mug in a cabinet unbearable in ways that defied explanation. He had gotten through it, slowly and imperfectly, the way people get through the unsurvivable things by continuing to exist, one day at a time, for the person who needed him to. Oliver needed him. That had been enough. In the years since, David had built a life that was quieter than the one he had imagined, but genuine. He worked as an independent contractor in building maintenance steady work, not glamorous, but honest and reliable, the kind that kept the lights on and put Oliver's sports equipment in the closet and occasionally allowed for a weekend away somewhere with trees and a river. He was not wealthy. Some months were tighter than others, and he had learned the particular discipline of someone who could not afford to be careless with money. But he was not bitter about it. He had encountered too much real loss to spend much energy resenting the ordinary inconveniences of a working life. What David had, in abundance, was an attentiveness to other people that most would have called empathy, but that he experienced less as a feeling and more as a reflex, an almost involuntary noticing of when someone nearby was in pain. It had begun after Rachel died, he thought. Someone had helped him once, during the worst of it, in a way so quiet and unexpected that it had recalibrated something in him permanently. He thought about that often. He had made a habit since then of paying attention. That Tuesday evening, after a long shift and a longer day, he stopped at the diner on his way home. Oliver was at a sleepover, and the apartment felt too quiet for cooking. He chose the corner table near the window out of habit, ordered black coffee and a hot meal, and settled in. It was only by chance that he noticed the woman sitting 2 tables away, her face turned slightly toward the window, her expression carrying something he recognized immediately and could not have named out loud, but knew in his chest, the way you know a wrong note in a song you have memorized. The evening had started well enough, or at least better than she had expected. Emily ordered a bowl of potato soup and a grilled cheese sandwich, simple, affordable, and let herself breathe. She watched the rain trace paths down the glass. She watched a couple near the wall share a plate of fries and argue cheerfully about something on a menu they had clearly seen 100 times before. She watched a grandmother help a very small child color a paper placemat with stubby crayons that kept rolling off the table. The ordinariness of it all was almost soothing. She had forgotten what it felt like to simply sit somewhere warm and inhabited by other living people and not have anywhere to be. For 20 minutes, she ate her soup slowly and let her mind rest, or tried to. The memories crept in anyway: her old apartment, the basil plants on the balcony, the campaigns she had run that had genuinely worked, the version of herself who had believed competence was enough armor against the world's cruelty. She missed that version. She was not sure she could find her way back to her. In the middle of her second half of the sandwich, her phone buzzed on the table. It was a number she recognized: the property management company for her current apartment. She let it ring twice before answering, and the conversation that followed was brief and unpleasant. Her automatic payment had failed. Rent was now 3 days overdue. And if it was not resolved within 48 hours, a late fee would be added. She said she understood. She said she would handle it. She set the phone down and looked at the remainder of her sandwich and felt the warmth of the diner recede slightly, as if a window had cracked open somewhere. She finished eating anyway, because she had come here for one good thing, and she was not going to surrender even that. When the server brought the check, a young woman with a cheerful demeanor who said, "Have a great evening," with the reflexive optimism of someone who had not yet needed to count things carefully. Emily smiled and thanked her, and then looked down at the bill and opened her app. The balance had changed since she last checked. An automatic payment she had scheduled days ago, a medical billing installment for her mother's care, had processed while she was sitting in the diner eating soup. What had been a thin margin was now a hollow number. She looked at the amount owed. She looked at what remained. She closed the app and opened it again. The number did not improve. She looked around the diner reflex, searching for an exit from an unbearable moment, and felt something she had never allowed herself to feel in public before: the specific, nauseating shame of being unable to meet a bill you have incurred. It was not a large amount. In another month of her former life, she would have covered it without thinking. The smallness of the number made it worse somehow, not better. She could not explain that to anyone. She would not have wanted to try. She gathered her jacket from the chair back, with the careful, deliberate movements of someone trying very hard not to attract attention, left the bill on the table, and walked toward the door. She had covered perhaps 2/3 of the distance to the exit, moving between tables, keeping her eyes down, calculating with the desperate arithmetic of the deeply embarrassed whether she could clear the door before anyone understood what was happening, when the server's voice cut through the ambient noise of the diner with a politeness that nonetheless stopped her cold. "Excuse me, ma'am?" Emily's stomach dropped. She turned slowly, prepared for what she assumed was coming: the quiet, humiliating negotiation, the explanation she did not want to give. The faces of other diners angled toward her with that particular mix of curiosity and pity that she would have done almost anything to avoid. The server was standing near the register, smiling in a way that was genuinely kind and slightly confused. "There's actually been a mix-up in our system tonight," the young woman said, speaking just quietly enough that the immediate neighboring tables could not easily follow. "Your check has already been taken care of. You're all set." Emily stared at her. "I'm sorry," she said. "What?" "Your bill. It was already handled. You're good to go. Sorry for any confusion." Emily blinked. She asked if there was a mistake. The server shook her head pleasantly. Emily asked who had paid it. The server looked briefly uncertain, then settled on a practiced expression. "I'm honestly not sure," she said. "It just came through. You're all taken care of." Emily stood in the middle of the diner for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Her jacket held against her chest, her mind working to reconstruct what had just happened, and finding no clean explanation. The server had already moved on to another table. The other diners had returned to their own conversations. The diner's ambient noise, the clinking, the murmuring, the occasional burst of laughter from across the room, continued without interruption, as though nothing unusual had occurred. Because to everyone present, nothing unusual had. Only Emily stood slightly out of place, suspended between relief and confusion, unable to locate the seam in the explanation she had just been given. She looked around the room, the couple with the fries, now arguing cheerfully over the last one, the grandmother helping the small child press a crayon too hard against the placemat, a table of 3 women sharing a slice of layer cake, with the focused camaraderie of people who have known each other for decades. And then, in the far corner, she saw a man in a flannel jacket counting bills from a wallet, setting them on the table with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done the mental math before sitting down. He was preparing to stand. She did not know why she looked at him specifically. Something in the peripheral record of the evening, some half-noticed detail she had not consciously catalogued, the way the mind stores information it has not yet decided it needs, pulled her gaze in that direction. He had his head down. He was not looking at her. He was very deliberately not looking at her. In the specific way of someone who has done something they do not want to be thanked for, who has arranged their attention elsewhere, as a matter of principle. She understood, in that moment, with a certainty that had nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with instinct, the same instinct that tells you when someone in a crowd is watching you, even before you turn around, exactly what had happened. She pushed through the front door of the diner into the cold rain, without letting herself think too much about it, moving on the energy of instinct before the more cautious part of her brain could raise objections. The parking lot was slick and dark, lit by a single overhead lamp that turned the puddles amber and made the wet asphalt gleam. The rain was still steady, not heavy enough to run from, but insistent enough to feel against the back of her neck and soak into her jacket shoulders within seconds. She heard the door open behind her and turned. The man in the flannel jacket walked out and moved toward the far end of the lot without looking back, his hands in his pockets, his pace unhurried, the posture of someone who believed the evening was over. "Excuse me," Emily said. Her voice was steadier than she expected, steadier than she had any right to expect, given that her hands were shaking and her heart was doing something irregular. He stopped. He stood still for just a fraction of a second too long before he turned. And that fraction told her everything she needed to know. Up close, he was ordinary looking in the way that solid, quietly competent people often are, not remarkable in any single feature, but possessing something in the arrangement of his expression that communicated reliability, the kind of face you trusted without quite knowing why, the kind that suggested this was a person who did what he said and meant what he implied. He looked at her with the calm assessment of someone deciding something. "Were you the one who paid my bill?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment. A beat too considered. "I don't think that was me," he said. He was not a good liar, or perhaps more accurately, he was someone who had not invested much effort in becoming one, because he had never found much use for it. She could see it immediately, not in any dramatic tell, not a flicker of the eyes or a tightening of the jaw, but in the slight, particular stillness of someone choosing words carefully, because the truth is sitting right behind them, patient and fully formed, simply waiting. "Please," she said. "I know it was you. I just want to know why." Something shifted in his expression, not surrender exactly, because he did not seem like a man who surrendered to things, but a kind of ease, the specific relaxation that comes when a pretense you were never entirely committed to is no longer required. "You looked like you needed a minute," he said simply. That's all. The rain was falling steadily between them, and Emily stood in it and felt something inside her that had been pulled taut for a very long time, strung tight across the long months of rejections and hospital waiting rooms and late-night spreadsheets and carefully composed expressions of fine, everything is fine, simply give way. She did not cry dramatically. It was not that kind of moment. It was quieter than that. Tears that came without warning and without theater. The kind that belong to relief more than sadness. The kind that arrive when you have been holding something heavy for so long that the moment someone acknowledges the weight, your body simply responds before you can decide whether to allow it. She pressed her hand over her mouth for a second and breathed. "It's not just the money," she said, when she could speak clearly. "I know it's not," he said. "I know." And the way he said it without pity, without the particular brand of sympathetic distance that people deploy when they are trying to be kind, without actually getting close, but simply, as though it were the most natural thing in the world to understand, as though her pain were not a problem to manage, but a reality to acknowledge, undid her completely for a moment. He told her his name. She told him hers. He told her, briefly and without drama, about a time 6 years ago when he had been standing in a different kind of parking lot, in a different kind of rain, in a version of Lost that had felt unsurvivable, and a stranger had done something small for him. He did not specify what exactly, and she did not ask that had mattered more than any large gesture could have. He had not forgotten it. He tried not to. It had become a kind of orientation point, a way of navigating. Emily wiped her face with the back of her hand and laughed once, a little unexpectedly. At the entire improbability of standing in a diner parking lot in November rain and feeling, against all reasonable expectation, less alone than she had in months. They stood there a while longer, talking about nothing in particular, the soup, which she said had been genuinely good, the weather, the treachery of automatic payments processing at the exact wrong moment. Small talk that was not quite small. Before David said he had better get home, they each reached for their phones at approximately the same moment, which made them both laugh. They exchanged numbers. She thanked him once more. He said there was nothing to thank him for. She did not argue, even though she disagreed completely. She sent the text the following morning. A simple, careful message that said she wanted him to know it had made a real difference, and that she hoped he had a good day. She reread it 3 times before sending it. Aware of the odd difficulty of expressing gratitude to a stranger for something that had meant more than she could fully articulate without sounding excessive, he replied 2 hours later. Apparently he was not someone who kept his phone in his hand, which she found immediately reassuring, with a message that said he was glad, and that things had a way of working out. It was not a deep observation. It was the kind of thing people said reflexively. The conversational filler of someone who did not know what else to offer, and yet it landed on her like something true, the way certain ordinary sentences do, when you receive them at exactly the moment your interior circumstances need them. Things have a way of working out. She had stopped believing that for a while. She found, to her mild surprise, that she believed it slightly more now. They texted again that evening, briefly. About nothing important. She had found a rare and excellent parking spot outside her apartment building for the first time in weeks, which felt disproportionately satisfying. He had finally resolved a boiler issue in a building on the east side that had been defying him for the better part of the week, which he reported with the quiet satisfaction of someone for whom solving problems that resist solving is a source of genuine professional pride. Small victories. The ordinary texture of 2 people carefully establishing conversational footing with each other. There was nothing romantic about it. Not yet. Perhaps not consciously at all on either side. They were simply 2 people who had discovered, in the clumsy and unlikely circumstances of a parking lot in the rain, that they could speak to each other without the particular strain that most new conversations involve, the performance of competence, the management of impression, and that was rarer than either of them, in their separate experience of the world, had come to expect. Over the following days, the text became a small, reliable feature of the day, not frequent enough to feel demanding, not sparse enough to feel accidental, just present enough to feel like something real taking shape at its own pace. Emily began telling him more, gradually, the way you lower yourself into cold water, testing the temperature before committing about the layoff and the month since, the rejection emails and the particular demoralization of sending out careful, tailored applications into what felt like a void, the weight of managing her mother's care from several hundred miles away, while trying to rebuild a professional life from components that kept refusing to assemble. She had not told most people these things. She had told her closest friend some of it, in edited versions. She was surprised by how easily it came out with David, not because he was especially probing, or because the situation compelled disclosure, but simply because he listened in a way that made talking feel safe rather than costly. He did not pivot to advice. He did not offer reassurance that rushed past the difficult part. He listened until she was finished, and then responded to what she had actually said, which in her experience was something fewer people did than one might hope. When she mentioned in passing that she had been sending applications without result for longer than she wanted to admit, he asked if he could take a look at her resume, not in the way someone offers to look at something as a conversational gesture, but with the directness of someone who has a specific and practical purpose in mind. She sent it over, without overthinking it. He called her that evening instead of texting, because some things were easier to say out loud, and he had enough suggestions that a text exchange would have taken the rest of the week. He spent 40 minutes walking her through it, the summary at the top, which was technically accurate but framed in a way that invited a reader to skim rather than lean in. The ordering of certain experiences that buried the most relevant work behind the most recent. The framing of the employment gap, which she had been handling with a defensive tentativeness that drew attention to it when the simpler, more direct approach would have neutralized it entirely. He knew a few people. He said not a network, not a roster, just a handful of individuals from various corners of his working life who might know someone or might themselves have a need, and he would mention her name if an opportunity came up organically, because she was clearly capable, and sometimes a name arriving through a trusted voice was the difference between a resume that got read and one that got filed. Emily wrote every suggestion down in the margins of a printed copy of the document and revised it that night and sent it back to him past midnight. He replied the next morning with 4 words. Yes, that's the one. She read them and felt something shift very slightly in the climate of her interior life, a small but perceptible change in the quality of the air, as though a window had been opened in a room that had been closed for a long time. She felt, for the first time, in many months, like someone engaged in the project of her own life, rather than simply surviving it. 3 weeks after the diner, an email arrived from a marketing director at a mid-sized firm Emily had applied to twice, once before the layoffs. Once after. The email was short. They had a position opening at the senior level. Her name had come to them through a mutual connection. Would she be available for a conversation on Thursday? She read it 3 times in the minute after it arrived, checking the sender address, with the careful suspicion of someone who had learned not to trust good news until it had been verified from multiple angles. It was real. Her hands were shaking slightly when she replied, yes, absolutely. Thursday worked perfectly. She called David. He picked up on the second ring and listened to her tell him the whole thing in a breathless, barely punctuated run of sentences, and then said, very calmly, and with what she could hear was genuine satisfaction, I told you. She laughed, the sudden, involuntary kind. The laugh of pressure releasing. The days leading up to the interview were a specific kind of agony, not the dull, depleting agony of months of rejection, but the sharper, more clarifying agony that comes with actually wanting something again after a long period of wanting nothing, because wanting had become too expensive, and the repeated disappointment of wanting things and not getting them had trained her to keep her hopes at a careful distance from herself. She prepared obsessively, mapping the company's recent campaigns, drafting answers to every likely question she could anticipate, rehearsing transitions between topics, timing responses to make sure she was neither too brief nor too expansive. She asked David to run through a mock version of the conversation with her 2 evenings before, and he obliged with the kind of straightforward helpfulness that had come to feel characteristic of him. No flattery, no cushioning, just honest feedback delivered in a way that made it useful rather than discouraging. The night before the interview, she texted him at 11:30 to say she was spiraling slightly, and he replied within minutes, you've survived things that would have flattened most people. This is just a conversation. Show them what you showed me. She read it 3 times, and then set the phone face down on the nightstand, and went to sleep with something approaching calm. The interview lasted 90 minutes. The director was sharp and direct. the kind of interviewer who did not waste time on pleasantries but clearly respected a candidate who could keep pace with a brisk exchange and bring something specific to each answer. Emily kept pace. She had answers that were concrete without sounding rehearsed, shaped by actual experience rather than the consulting of interview preparation guides. She asked good questions, questions that showed she had done the research and was thinking about the work rather than simply about getting the job. She left the building and stood on the sidewalk in the cold November air, and felt, cautiously but unmistakably, that it had gone well, genuinely well, not the fragile, wishful kind of well that people construct to protect themselves from disappointment, but the solid kind. The kind grounded in the reasonable confidence of someone who had done the preparation and executed it. She called David from the sidewalk. He asked how it went. She said she thought it actually went well. He said good, because I already knew it would. A week later, on a Wednesday afternoon while she was folding laundry in her small apartment, her phone rang with an unfamiliar number. The director's assistant offered her the position, senior marketing manager, full benefits, the kind of salary that would let her stop doing the careful nightly mathematics of rent versus groceries versus the medical bills still arriving from her mother's treatment. Emily sat down slowly on the floor of her apartment, still holding a shirt she had been folding, and said yes in a voice that came out much quieter than she intended. The first person she told was David. He answered the phone, and before she could get through the first sentence, she was already crying, and then he started laughing, the warm and unguarded laugh of someone who had genuinely cared about an outcome and been genuinely glad of it. And then she was laughing too, and they stayed on the phone for almost an hour afterward, talking about entirely nothing, which was exactly what the moment required. 3 months into the new job, Emily's life had reorganized itself into something that resembled stability, not the glossy, effortless stability she had once taken for granted, but the earned kind, the kind that feels different because you remember what it cost. She had moved into a better apartment. Her mother's health had improved significantly. She was meeting her rent easily and had started, tentatively, to rebuild a small savings cushion. She was good at her job in a way that felt authentic, rather than performed. She understood, with a clarity the layoff had given her involuntarily, what actually mattered in the work, and what was simply noise, and she made decisions accordingly. She was grateful for the job. She was grateful for many things, more often and more concretely than she had been before the bad year, because she now understood that gratitude was not a sentiment but a discipline, a practice of noticing what you had while you had it. She was also, and she knew this clearly, deeply grateful for David, and she had been thinking for several weeks about what that gratitude required of her. She knew he was struggling. He had never complained about it, that was not his way, but through the months of conversation she had come to understand his financial situation well enough to know that certain things were quietly difficult. A client had dropped him earlier in the year, and work had been inconsistent since. He managed, but the margins were thin, and some months he was stretching further than he let on. Emily had connections now that she had not had a year ago, and she had been thinking carefully about how to use them. She made a series of phone calls. She talked to 2 former colleagues and an old mentor who had started her own consulting firm. She explained what she knew about David's work, his reliability, his skill, his integrity, and she was specific about what she thought might be a good fit. A week before the dinner she was planning, she had 3 commitments in hand from people willing to offer him either contracts or referrals, totaling more consistent work than he currently had. It was not charity. She was careful about that. These were people who needed exactly what he could provide, and she had simply introduced the right names to each other. She organized a dinner at a small restaurant and told David it was just a get-together with some people she wanted him to meet. He came in his good jacket, looking slightly wary of surprises, which made her smile. Over the course of the evening, the 3 conversations unfolded organically. And by the time dessert arrived, David understood what she had done. He sat across from her after the others had stepped away briefly, and looked at her in a way that had no adequate response in it. Not embarrassment exactly, and not the stiff discomfort of someone who resisted being helped, but something rawer than either. the particular emotion of a person who does not know how to receive the thing they most needed. He started to say something and stopped. She said, "You said a stranger helped you once, and you just tried to keep that going." He nodded. "So do I," she said. The months that followed were woven through with the quiet accumulation of something real. It was not sudden. Neither of them would have trusted sudden. They had both been through enough to know that the things that arrive loudly often leave the same way. What happened between Emily and David was slower and more certain than that. A growing fluency in each other's company. A comfort that deepened without announcement. A mutual understanding that had begun as gratitude and friendship, and had slowly, without either of them marking the moment it shifted, become something more specific and irreplaceable. There were coffee mornings where the conversation started about work and arrived somewhere entirely different. There were evenings when one of them was having a hard time, and the other appeared without much fanfare, and sat with the difficulty instead of trying to fix it. There was Oliver, who took a while to warm up to Emily, and then one afternoon decided he trusted her during a board game that got inexplicably competitive, and after that treated her with the kind of casual affection that children offer only when they have stopped thinking about it. Emily adored him. She was careful about that too. Careful not to presume or to push. But the affection was genuine, and Oliver felt it, and David watched the two of them, and felt something in his chest that he had spent years not allowing himself to name. He was afraid of it, honestly. He knew what love cost when it went wrong. He had the specific knowledge of that cost, embedded in 6 years of waking up to an absence where a presence had been, and the idea of being wrong about something like this again, of letting himself need someone and having that need become another wound he would carry, was something he could not take lightly. Emily was afraid too, in her own way. She had spent the previous year learning, against her will, that the foundations she had trusted could shift without warning. And the idea of building something on another person, of trusting her own judgment about something as high stakes as love, was not uncomplicated. They talked about it, eventually, on a Thursday evening in early spring, when they were walking along the river and neither of them was pretending about what was happening. David said he wanted to be honest with her about the fear. She said she had the same one. They stood on the footbridge, and the water moved beneath them, and the city lights reflected in broken patterns on the surface. And David said carefully, in the way of someone choosing each word, that he had not let himself hope for something like this in a long time. And she said she knew, and she said she was not going anywhere, and they stood there in the mild spring air until the city got quiet around them. On a warm Saturday evening in late spring, David drove to the small diner on the edge of the highway, the same one, the Tuesday evening, one with the neon signs and the smell of coffee and grilled onions, and Emily sat in the passenger seat and did not ask where they were going until they pulled into the parking lot, and she recognized it, and felt the recognition hit her somewhere deep and tender. They went inside. The same booths. The same linoleum floors. The same particular warmth of a diner that has been exactly what it is for decades, without apology. The server who seated them was not the same young woman from that night, but the table David guided her toward a small two-top near the window was the same one Emily had sat at alone with her soup and her failing bank account, and the suffocating shame of a life that had come undone. She sat down and looked at the window, and looked at her hands, and felt the distance between then and now as something almost physical, like a texture she could run her fingers across. David sat across from her, and did not speak for a moment, giving the weight of the place time to settle around them. Then he said, "I want to tell you something I've been thinking about for a while." She looked at him. "That night," he said, "I thought I was just doing a small thing, just paying a bill, something that cost me almost nothing and might make one bad evening slightly easier for someone I didn't know." He paused. I had no idea. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the parking lot, in the rain, when she had asked him why directly and without performance, as though deception were simply not a mode available to him. I had no idea that the stranger I was trying to help for 5 minutes was going to become the best thing that has happened to me in years, the best thing that has happened to Oliver and me. Emily felt the tears come the way they had that night quietly, without theater, the kind that carry relief and love, and the accumulated weight of a hard year, arriving at something it had not known it was walking toward. Around them, the diner went about its business, in the particular gentle way of diners on Saturday evenings. The clink of glasses, the murmur of other conversations, the smell of coffee, and something on the grill. Someone at a nearby table heard enough to understand something, and started to applaud softly. And two others joined in. And for a brief, improbable moment in the middle of an ordinary restaurant on an unremarkable Saturday, the air filled with that particular warmth that exists only when strangers decide, together, that something deserves to be recognized. Emily laughed and cried at the same time. David reached across the table and took her hand. Oliver, who had been sitting 2 tables away pretending to read the kids' menu with focused concentration, looked up and rolled his eyes with the theatrical suffering of a 9-year-old surrounded by adults, doing embarrassing things, which made Emily laugh harder than anything else in the evening, which was, she would later say, exactly right. There is a version of kindness that announces itself, that arrives with ceremony and documentation, that understands its own goodness, and expects to be recognized for it. It is not a bad kind of kindness. It does real good in the world. But there is the other kind, the kind that moves quietly, that pays a stranger's bill, and instructs the server not to explain why, that shows up not because it is convenient, but because it has made a habit of noticing, and that habit has become so embedded in the person that they would not know how to stop even if they tried. David Mercer had the second kind. He had come by it honestly through loss, through the particular education that only devastation provides, through a night 6 years ago, when someone had done a small, unasked-for thing for him that had kept something alive that might otherwise have gone dark. He had never considered himself especially virtuous. He had simply paid attention and then acted on what he saw, and gone home afterward and thought nothing more of it. He could not have predicted any of what followed. None of it had been part of a plan. Emily Carter, sitting across from him in the diner that had been the beginning of everything, holding his hand across a table, set with paper placemats and slightly mismatched silverware, while the people around them applauded for reasons they only partially understood, knew something that would have been difficult to explain to her former self, the version of herself who had believed that stability was the product of effort and planning and the diligent management of risk. She had lost a career, and a car, and an apartment, and a version of herself she had been very attached to. She had spent a year in a kind of freefall, reaching for handholds and finding mostly air. She had come to a diner on a rainy Tuesday with $8 in her account because she needed one good thing, and she had run out of better options. And from all of that, from the rejection and the exhaustion and the $41 bill she could not pay, she had arrived here. The lesson, if there was one, and life rarely wraps itself in lessons neatly, but sometimes it comes close enough to make the attempt worth noting, was not complicated and was not new. It was, in fact, as old as the instinct to help a stranger. A single moment of attention, a single choice to act on what you noticed instead of looking away, had set in motion everything that followed: an $8 account, and a $41 bill, and a man in a corner booth who could have kept his eyes on his coffee, and would never have known the difference. He had not kept his eyes on his coffee. When life had taken Emily's hope, and her stability, and her certainty that she understood the shape of her own future, a stranger's small act of quiet kindness had done something that no job offer or financial recovery could have done on its own. It had reminded her that the world contained people who were paying attention. That had been the thing she had lost, and had not known how to name: not the money, not the stability, not the career, but the simple, sustaining knowledge that she was not invisible, that someone in the crowded, indifferent world was looking in her direction and choosing to act on what they saw. And sometimes, when what has been taken is hope, what is required to bring it back is not a grand gesture or a dramatic reversal, or a narrative that resolves with satisfying symmetry. Sometimes what is required is one person, in one corner of one small diner on a rainy Tuesday night, choosing to see. The rest, the friendship, the job, the laughter. The small boy rolling his eyes at a corner table, the hand held across mismatched silverware, while strangers applauded. The rest followed from that. It always does.